we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. I'm your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever want to reach out to the podcast for any reason, hit us up on our DMs on our X or on our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. You can, like I said, let us know if you wanted to hear an episode, if you wanted to come on as a guest, you know, all that fun stuff. So I always like to hear from you. I'd like to hear from you in the comments, especially on today's episode, because I feel like, well, I hope we can get a little bit more discussion going on, whether it's in the comments or wherever, because this is something that's kind of been, it's been gripping me for a while. So I'll finish my intro here. If you ever wanted to, you know, just by watching, by you being here, you're doing the most. You're doing a service to us at the podcast here. You're supporting us in the best way possible, listening or watching on YouTube or wherever you are. But if you are watching, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button on the videos. Try to rate the podcast if you have a chance. But tell your friends, and then check out our Patreon, patreon.com/BigmarkPod, for a couple other options and ways to support the podcast that way. But anyway, again, thank everyone for being here, because, you know, this is an episode where, you know, if you're a longtime listener, you know me, there's some times where I'm kind of, you know, coming up with the podcast the day of, hours before the podcast comes up, just because, again, you know, I feel like I want to be as topical as possible with certain topics, like, you know, in the sense, like, sometimes things happen in the week and I want to South Park it and make sure it's as fresh as possible. But then again, I want these to be conversations, you know, as much as it's strange for just you and I to be sitting here. You know, I do want, I do want this to feel like at least a one-way conversation. I mean, obviously it's hard for you to respond, but, you know, it's not me preaching here. You know, so a lot of these are my own thoughts. You know, a lot of episodes I do on kind of grandiose ideas and grandiose topics that do transcend certain things and do transcend, you know, the realms of, like, my own knowledge, at least. And I'm, you know, again, I'm trying to kind of explore different ideas. So again, today is obviously going to be very, very closely based on a topic, which is the OJ Simpson case. But I know this is a topic that's not going to take one podcast. In fact, this is going to be part one. I might do part two next week, but I might continue to add parts to this, because it's kind of one of these things where it's gripped me in a way that I'm interested in that alone. I feel like in some ways I have been swept up in the OJ Simpson madness, even though it's 20 years later. Well, 20 and a half years later at this point, almost to the day. But the reason why I want to talk about it again is to try to create this conversation, try to create this dialogue, because I want to hear from people who were older than me at the time, at least when this was happening. I was going to say alive at the time, because I was also alive, but I was 3 years old when this happened. Again, I'm going to try to go through every aspect of the case. And today's episode, I feel like I'm going to try not to get into too much of the nitty gritty, maybe not even give you the entire story. I just want to kind of talk about how gripping it truly is. I mean, again, it's something where, you know, I'm talking to my friends at work, you know, and I'm watching documentaries and I'm listening to podcasts, and it's like, it's something that, you know, it feels all consuming in the way of I'm just so interested in it that there's so many different facets to it that I feel like I'm back in 1994, 1995, when all these trials were happening. I feel like I'm a part of how other people were reacting to this when it was happening. I mean, you know, this was one of the first times, it wasn't the first time, but it was one of the few first times that um, uh, any murder trial was going to be televised. It was a brutal murder. It was an awful murder. Had piles and piles, mountains, to quote Marcia Clark, a mountain of evidence, seemingly open and shut, but it also had celebrity. It had race. It had, the history of racial violence and law enforcement at Los Angeles. And it had OJ Simpson, man. Like, OJ Simpson was somebody, and this is funny, we have a lot of these debates and conversations nowadays, as far as who's the greatest basketball player of all time, who's the greatest this, who's the greatest that, who's the GOAT. And we're always comparing modern contemporary people to pastime. Again, LeBron versus Michael Jordan. I find these conversations and I find these comparisons, well, they're certainly hypothetical, but they're kind of pointless, because most of these characters, the people who are judging these athletes, at least a lot of my contemporaries, weren't old enough to see both in their prime. We're old enough to see LeBron in his prime, and we see highlights of Jordan, but we never watched him. And I think that's the same thing goes with OJ Simpson. And even a lot of people at the time watching the case, if they didn't care about football or they didn't watch certain movies, I mean, that basically excludes quite a few people, but, or maybe I should say that doesn't exclude very many people, because there's a lot of people who like to watch football and watch movies. But if you didn't fall into any of those categories, you might have not have known who OJ Simpson was. And then if you're getting into the case now, like I am, and understanding it, I never really knew who OJ Simpson was to the public. I had knowledge that he was a football player. But I didn't understand that he was one of the greatest football players of all time. He was the first running back to ever rush to 2,000 yards, which is really far if you don't know anything about football in one season. That's 20 times up and down the field, everybody. But no. And he was amazing. He was inducted in the Hall of Fame, which is the NFL Hall of Fame is one of the hardest halls of fame to get into. Just due to the sheer number of football players that are out there that are great. But OJ, of course, was a shoo-in. And then he went on to have a successful sportscasting and movie career. He was in, he was the Naked Gun series. He was in a handful of movies and TV shows. But again, he was this personality that was beloved, and he was, he was kind of considered, basically he was kind of considered this man who transcended race. He wasn't really black, and he definitely wasn't white, but they say, he said himself, I'm not black, I'm OJ. And it's an interesting thing to say, because it sounds kind of delusional. I mean, he's a black man, he's African American, but yet he lived and thrived and was successful in a white world. And in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, there was definitely a racial divide, and people were more aware of it, or more likely to draw attention to it, probably in a negative way. But I feel like today, we try to be politically correct around these things, and we try to step around race so much. It's become something completely different. And not to say that the violence and things that happened in all of history between the races should still exist. I think we're moving in the right direction. But I still think that there's a lot of bigoted people out there. There's a lot of people who really don't understand that, we're all one people. And it's sad to see any type of racial tension, especially in a world today where we're so connected globally. We're so a part of this world that we do know a lot more about what our neighbor is up to. We do know a lot more about what other countries are going through, and hardships and inequalities that exist all in the world. But yet we still have these people that can turn a blind eye to that and still live in these antiquated ideas that only sow more division and sow more divide, and create this rift that has ebbed and flowed, but has still never really closed between all the races. But of course, between black and white in America, they have a long history of tension. I don't know, man. That's probably the understatement of the fucking millennia. But from slavery to segregation to Jim Crow South rules to redlining and civil wars and just general tomfoolery from the Americans. There has existed this just this terrible stance between black and white people, and it should never exist. We're all the same. Yes, there's cultural differences, which is totally fine. We should celebrate that. I've always wanted to stay in touch with my Eastern European roots, and I know they're fucking different from other people, and I'm not saying that they're better than. I'm definitely not saying that they're better than anyone else's. I just like to do them, like to keep doing it myself. But everyone else is, of course, able and has the free right to do whatever they want, and I mean to celebrate their culture. And I don't think that should encroach on anyone else and should affect anyone else's life for that matter. So anyway, without going down that road, well, I guess it's inevitable to go down that road when we're talking about the OJ case, because it was a case that transcended the actual event that OJ was on trial for. I mean, if you have no idea about the case, hopefully you have some idea about the case, but if not, OJ was put on trial for the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, and he was acquitted. His lawyers got him off essentially. And for all intents and purposes, he got away with murder. And the way his defense team got him off was by essentially playing the race card, and also playing the doubt card, I guess you could say. But by creating the doubt in the LAPD, they basically undermined the LAPD, and the witnesses that were involved. All of them were discredited. Or almost all of them were discredited in some way by the defense, and that just made it look so terrible for the jurors. And the jury had a lot of happenings going on. I mean, they were supposed to be sequestered for, they thought that it was going to be a few weeks, up to 6 months, which is still a long time, but they were expecting it to be anywhere between a few weeks and 6 months. It ended up being 9 months. And they weren't treated very well. Actually, a lot of new jury rules have changed. I guess that's maybe redundant, but a lot of the rules that jurors have to follow have changed from the OJ case. A lot of the sequestering rules and stuff, and things just got really shady. And again, we'll get into that in detail in further episodes, but kind of everything that could go wrong went wrong with this case. If you're the prosecution, they made some blunders, they made some poor decisions, but again, overall, this just became so much bigger than a gruesome, horrible murder that was probably fucking perpetrated by OJ. And if it wasn't by OJ alone, it was by OJ and someone else. Like, it's overwhelming, the evidence. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things for myself. It's like, how can all this evidence, all these things, all these different the timeline. OJ has no alibi. The gloves. Again, we'll get into all this stuff in detail later. Mark Furman's testimonies. What Kato Kalin said. The limo driver. All the other fucking, people are like, oh, what's the motive? What's this and that? It was a domestic battery. It was a domestic violence case. There was 8 times that the LAPD were called up to OJ's place or OJ and Nicole's place at the time. And that's only 8 times that they were called. Who knows how many other times OJ, was beating on Nicole, like beating her. And I think she broke her arm. He broke her arm once, and then they went to the hospital and they lied and said she fell off her bike. There was one time she did press charges on him in the 80s. And, he kind of brushes that off. Again, the guy, OJ Simpson, I want to say brilliant, but it's too nice of a word. He's an evil genius almost, in the sense that he has a weaponized charisma. He is so amazingly able to disarm everyone. And I think this was one of the concerns, and this is what one of Nicole's concerns definitely was, because she voiced it, but this was one of the concerns of everyone involved in the prosecution, was that OJ was going to OJ killed Nicole, and he was going to get away with it because he's OJ Simpson. I think the way the LAPD, completely blundered a lot of the shit. A lot of them were starstruck. A lot, even though it's Los Angeles, OJ Simpson had a lot to do with the LAPD. He was a football star, and a lot of the cops are football fans. And that's not being stereotypical. That's just the way it is. A lot of them are ex-athletes and played football themselves, and OJ hung out with them a lot. And it was almost, we'll go into the psyche further and further into OJ's psyche, but a lot of the things he did as an abuser was a way to set up himself for later dates, where he knew he'd probably have a run-in with the cops eventually, but if he's got them on his side, maybe he's going to get away with it. But again, it's a tragic story of domestic violence. It was tumultuous from day one. The first date that OJ ever went on with Nicole, when he was 29 and she was 18, and OJ was still married to his first wife, Marguerite. They went out on a date after OJ met her when she was waitressing at a restaurant, and they go out on their date, and Nicole was living with her roommate at the time, and he stayed up and waited for her. And at 2 a.m. she comes home, and she's got a rip in her jeans, and the roommate goes, "Nicole, what happened to your jeans?" And she said, "Oh, OJ just got a little rough, and he tore my jeans a little bit." First date, first time they ever went out. So this odd, scary kind of foreshadowing of what was to come, maybe. And just the blatant disrespect and narcissism, and again, just the psychology of it is fascinating to me. OJ's psychology, Nicole's psychology, the whole psychology of the jurors, and the psychology of America, the way this gripped the world. And this is another thing I want to know, if anyone's listening who wants to tell me, who knows, what was it like in Canada? What was it like in other countries? If how did this story get, I listened to a podcast where there was a woman from England, and she was talking about, how the OJ case was on English news, UK news a lot. And she was aware of it. I mean, she was also working in law enforcement and prosecution stuff. So I think she was a little bit more privy to that stuff, or at least a little bit more interested. But again, he's a football star and African-American, in LA. The other big thing you got to remember is that leading up to that, the early 90s were fucking crazy in LA. You had the Rodney King beatings. You had Latasha Harlan getting shot. You had the fucking LA riots. All this shit was going on before OJ did what he fucking did. And this is all in the back of every officer's mind, every criminalist, every person who was on that fucking scene. That shit's still on your mind. That a couple years ago, that fucking way that they handled shit caused a riot, and they never want that to happen again. And that changed policing, you know, forever after what happened there. And you know, the way that they treated the Bronco chase was super weird. Again, they had a lot on the line. If they accidentally caused the death of OJ Simpson, at the time no one knew that he was a wife beater and you know, murderer yet, but you know, he was a football star and this beloved character. And again, I guess if he was acquitted, if he was proven not guilty, if they found that it was not him and he accidentally killed himself, or they accidentally killed him, or ran him off the road, or he shot himself and he was innocent, then it would have been even a bigger deal because he wasn't a murderer. And I mean, definitely a batterer that still existed before the case. But if he didn't kill anybody, this would have been really fucked. But they were scared and they just took their time. And again, once the case started happening, the way OJ's defense team just started throwing smoke bombs everywhere, just throwing mud on the case so that no one could really see through all the evidence, discrediting it, discrediting the DNA, discrediting the collection habits, and again, bringing race into this whole thing where OJ didn't even know he didn't even hang with any black people except like his friends and family from like day one. All his friends were white. Rob Kardashian, you know, the leader of Hertz, he was golfing all the time. He was just like, he was in a white world. And again, not that there's anything wrong with that. He just didn't identify with being black. And as soon as he got charged with double homicide, Johnny Cochran goes, "You're black now." Like, now you're black kind of thing. It's like, it's not fair because you've co-opted the hardship. Because again, I'm not diminishing what black people have gone through in America, what African Americans have gone through with law enforcement. It's been heinous. It still continues to be heinous. All this shit was in 94. Think of all the bullshit, all the murders, all the killings, all the George Floyds, all the everybody's that have been fucking killed up until this point by law enforcement. And it's awful and it shouldn't happen. And it's disproportionate. And, you know, you can say there's socioeconomic statistics that go along with crime, but again, still shouldn't be fucking killing people, man, and treating them differently than you would. But it comes from these places where guys get burnt out and guys see things. You know, we'll look more into Mark Furman, you know, one of the officers that was on the case, and he had a tumultuous past. He had a really rough past, and I think his history and his experience was not an isolated case. It's probably not something that the LAPD is going to want to talk about a lot, but there's probably a lot of guys out there that have ill feelings towards a lot of the communities that they had to deal with day in and day out and never saw a change, never saw a difference, and kept coming to the same place over and over again, doing the same thing day in and day out and not seeing a change. Again, that's a systemic issue. That's something bigger. But when you're so hyper-focused and you're in there and your life is on the line, you know, you can develop some phobias. You can develop some disorders. So all these things were happening in LA. The fucking place was a goddamn fucking powder keg. And then all of a sudden all this stuff happens. And it completely divided the country across the racial line. Whites versus blacks, you know, when the verdict came out, you know, this is not a spoiler alert, you know, everyone should know this by now, but when the verdict of not guilty came out, the fucking black community cheered and the fucking white community cried. It was that simple. It was a complete fucking 50-50 split, and I'm sure a lot of friendships were ruined and a lot of fucking workplaces got real weird. But it's fucked, man. Like, that's so that's so crazy, but so intriguing. Again, this is how much people got into it. And there's another question about the whole thing is that was the media, you know, the media played a part in this. Was the media showing us a case that wasn't necessarily happening in the courtroom? You know, was the reality of what was happening in the courtroom, was that what the media was showing us. You know, the media was privy to a lot more information than was actually shown in the courts, right? So some of this information the jurors were never permitted to see. But yet we were allowed to see interviews with witnesses after the fact, hearsay, all types of shit. And that's how the public made their decisions. And a lot of people looked at it as, you know, OJ did it. Look at the evidence. He obviously did it. And then a lot of people looked at it like the LAPD is setting him up. He's just another black man, just another African American being set up by the system. And it was a shame that was the divide, and that the evidence, the overwhelming evidence, which I understand, you know, you can say, hey, this stuff was planted and Furman planted the glove and stuff, but we'll come back to this time and time again because this is the kind of fucking killer. And Alan Dershowitz said this. He goes, for Mark Furman to have planted the glove. So as an aside, before I go into this soliloquy, Mark Furman, one of the detectives who was on the case, answered the call at Bundy, which is where they found Ron and Nicole. And then they rushed over to OJ's house because they you know, the three officers, Tom Lang and something Van Adder, can't remember all their names right now. Don't worry, I'll tighten things up when we get into the gritty. But three officers, including Mark Furman, three detectives, went over to OJ's house, and they thought he was involved. They thought this gruesome murder was to get at OJ. They were trying to find OJ. And someone who could do this could potentially kill OJ too, because it was such a violent crime. So that's what they said. I mean, what the defense said is that they thought, okay, for sure OJ did this. And that might not be totally wrong, because Furman had answered a call there when he was an officer to a domestic battery call, and OJ had a bat and had beaten in Nicole's windshield. So maybe there was a thought in Furman's mind that, maybe OJ did this, because, you know, I think it's 50% of domestic homicides or domestic violence cases turn into a homicide. That might be coming straight out of my ass, but I'm pretty sure it's 50%. So it's pretty fucking scary that a recorded domestic battery situation between OJ and Nicole never was taken seriously enough, and it got to this point. But anyway, when Mark Furman and these other two officers, Lang and Van Adder, were at the OJ premises, Mark Furman found a glove. He found a bloody glove. And when they were at Bundy, they also found a bloody glove. In fact, 4 other officers had seen this glove before they told Mark Furman, hey, there's this bloody glove here, watch out. So Furman sees the glove at OJ's place, you know, records it, collects it, puts it in evidence. And then when he's called to the stand, the defense essentially accuses him of planting the glove. Now, the only way, again, this is the quote from Alan Dershowitz, who inevitably was on OJ's defense team, but up until that point, he was a law professor and like law pundit on news channels, commenting on trials much like the OJ Simpson case. And in fact, they brought him on the Dream Team so that he couldn't make comments and help the prosecution. But we'll get into that later as well. Again, Alan Dershowitz said, the only way that Mark Furman could have planted the glove and would have been able to plant the glove was if he knew that OJ had no alibi. He was in no restaurant. He was in no woman's bed. He was with no friends for dinner. He was with no friends on the golf course. He had no alibi. And how could Mark Furman possibly know? How could he possibly know that OJ Simpson would have zero alibi, that he wouldn't be doing anything at that time? So it's a pretty big whoopsie in the old case there for the defense. But again, they made it so much bigger. They made it so much bigger than what the case was. They created something that's so much bigger, and those defense lawyers fucking just laughed their way through it, and they just laughed their way all the way to the bank, and didn't really seem to care about the political and racial impact that might have on the country. You know, Marsha Clark, one of the main prosecutors, and Chris Darden both stopped process. That was their last, or at least Marsha Clark's last case that she fought for the DA. And again, a lot of blunders, a lot of bad, and just lots of ins and outs and what have you. And it's fascinating. And like I said, we're only scratching the surface. Better come up for air. But anyway, we'll get into it more. We'll get into the psyche. We'll try to crack open my own fucking brain compartments and understand why I'm so interested in it. Because this is something I'm not necessarily, like, I like, true crime stuff's pretty interesting to me. I guess you could call this true crime. But I'm not super into it. Making a murderer was kind of cool. But I don't know. I find it hella morbid most of the time. And this is really morbid. The violence in this case and what happened in the actual murders is terrible, and I don't want to ever know anything about it, and I don't want to hear more about it. And we'll talk about it eventually on here, because I think it's important to know what actually happened. But again, that's not the stuff that interests me. It's the feelings of where I feel this connection to the world, or to all these people who were watching this case closely when this was happening. And it's equal. I believe it to be equally fascinating, and it's super cool that there is a lot of information out there. And the civil trials that happened, a lot of that was videotaped, and he basically confessed it. Like he lost the civil trial. They found him responsible for Ron Nicole's death. And again, whether that was him and someone else, him and his son Jason, him and fucking Marcus Allen, I don't even know, him and AC. So again, we'll get into all these names. We'll get into all these people. Who knows? But it's an interesting thing. Anyway, thanks all for listening. Let me know what you know. Hit me up in the comments. I want to hear about where were you when you heard the OJ verdict and all that shit. If you were alive, if you were around. If not, let me know if you have any questions about some of this stuff. Again, I'm voraciously consuming this information, so I know a couple things or two right now. So thanks all for listening. Can't wait for the next part, whenever, TBC, to be continued. But we'll get to it later. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for hitting us up, supporting the podcast. Love y'all. Keep on rocking in the free world. Doot doot doot. OJ did it. Peace.